We'll discuss Vice President of India, M. Venkaiah Naidu's address at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization of the Council of Head of Government Summit. Now, addressing a virtual meeting, Vice President Venkaiah Naidu, while underlining India's brave fight against COVID-19 pandemic and economic recovery, condemned terrorism, describing it as most important challenge faced by countries in the region. Now, chairing this summit, the Vice President also stressed on the collective need to combat the scourge of terrorism. It was also the first time that India chaired a summit-level meeting of the SCO since it gained full membership of the organization in the year 2017. Highlighting India's fight against the coronavirus pandemic, Mr. Naidu especially talked about resilience shown by India in ensuring economic stability. The Council of Heads of Government is the second highest body of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and is responsible for handling the group's trade and economic agenda and approving its annual budget. So what were the major takeaways from Vice President's address at the SCO Council of Heads of the Government Summit? Well, to discuss more on these issues, we're joined with Mr. Vishnu Prakash. He's a former ambassador. Arvind Gupta, Director, Vivekanand International Foundation, and Professor Swaran Singh, Chairperson, Center for International Politics in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining this show. Let me start with you, Mr. Vishnu Prakash. Sir, what are the key takeaways from the Vice President's address at the SCO Council, given he emphasized on extremely important issue of economic recovery in India amid the pandemic and, of course, the terrorism that he underlined pretty much in his address? Sir.
Absolutely. You have already highlighted the key points that the Honorable Vice President made. This is the first time after India joined the SCO summit as a full member that we are hosting the summit, and that way it is a watershed in India's engagement with the SCO process. And the Vice President, in his opening remarks, spoke of matters which are of great importance to India and the world at large. He highlighted the scourge of terrorism, as you mentioned,
right?
And this is one issue which affects any and every nation, and there is a united front that has to be presented. That is important, and particularly it is important because the source of the terrorism was also in the virtual summit, and this message had to be heard directly. Economic recovery is something that every country is concerned about. The world is in deep recession, and the recession has been triggered by the coronavirus. So ways and means have to be found to maintain multilateral system, a transparent system, so that the world can get back to a process of economic growth. Similarly, the Vice President made some very important announcements, including spoke of the working group, special working group on innovation and startup, where India is one of the world leaders, about traditional medicine. And last but not the least, he spoke about, he cautioned the members and the world at large against attempts to violate the territorial integrity and sovereignty of countries, and that is something that needed to be guarded against. So he highlighted all important matters of concern, the possible synergies. But having said that, and I'll come back to this point a little later, India's engagement with the SCO process is something that we need to reflect on, given the fact that there are developments which are not very conducive to good engagement and cooperation of India with the SCO process.
Right. Mr. Vishnu Prakash, so just stay on. I'll come back to you. Let me open up the discussion here. Professor Swaran Singh, I want to understand from you how important is a grouping such as SCO Council or the SCO Summit is vis-a-vis significance of the post-COVID world order, sir?
I think it's very interesting to see the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a group of stellar regional institutions and organizations.
Right.
Among these, Shanghai Cooperation Organization has usually been seen bringing Russia, China, and India together. And they have been seen as a trio which has always stood at variance when it comes to the dominant narratives of Western powers.
Right.
Lately, of course, because of the pandemic COVID-19 originating in China, there has been a certain angst, anxiety, anger vis-a-vis Chinese. And therefore, these repeated engagements with Russia and China of India are again showcasing that it's a very well-calibrated, balanced approach to foreign policy that India has. And therefore, Shanghai Cooperation Organization brings Russia, China, and India, but in the context of world's largest regional organization of 8 member states, 6 dialogue partners, 4 observer states, then there are special invitees. So it's the largest regional organization, both in terms of geographical expense and population. But more important, the potential, which again the Vice President today underlined, of the 5 trillion economy, and that's not only India.
Yeah.
These are countries that can potentially see much faster growth rates and much faster transformation. And therefore, you understand the emphasis being laid on health ministers meeting and exploring the traditional medicine, which is again at variance with how the West is looking at. So in that sense, it's a important organization where India is now going to be the chair. And interesting it is that India is taking over the chair of Shanghai Cooperation Organization with some of the other similar organizations. For example, we are now chair of the World Health Assembly.
Right.
Or we will also be now chairing the BRICS, for example. So in a situation of this global challenge of pandemic, which is health crisis plus economic crisis, this obtains India an important positioning in multilateralism and in promoting multilateralism around the world and giving a direction as to how to address the challenge of pandemic, but also how to build the post-pandemic world order, which is where I think there's a common understanding among most major nations that there needs to be emphasis on rule of law, which actually means a certain restraint on Chinese behavior. And in that sense, this is an engagement where India and China come together, but also at the same time ensuring that there is a wider spectrum of India's engagements, and India is not being seen, as sometimes headlines insinuate, as drifting away to the West, but is having a holistic approach to foreign policy in engaging all major powers. And in that sense, India becoming chair of Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a very important timing of this opportunity for India to provide a direction to the holistic approach to foreign policy.
Right. Mr. Arvind Gupta, let me just contextualize here. I'm just quoting what the Vice President said, that India and the SCO region share ancient, historical, cultural and civilizational linkages. As Dr. Swaran Singh was just talking about, like the shared features between the geographical domain of these countries. Now, taking that forward, with what direction do you see for summit like SCO and India's placing in that? Mr. Gupta.
I think this point about shared culture and history is extremely important because we have seen that over the last few centuries, this connect was broken, whereas it is one of the oldest connect India when Buddhism started spreading and the Indian influences started traveling to Central Asia first, and then to China, then to Korea and Japan, etc. Now, India is rising, and India has to find a narrative for itself, for its own rise. And I think we must look at some of these historical connections India had and global engagements India had, to give that depth to the Indian narrative that is now in the making. So I was very happy to see that particular mention. And I think there is going to be also a exhibition of museums, which is to take place in Delhi, where all the countries are going to showcase the Buddhist connection, etc. And it is also important, specifically in the context of China taking a leadership role in Buddhism. Whereas India has somewhere over the last few years, maybe because of our faulty notion of secularism, or maybe we did not think through these issues properly, we let that leadership pass to China. Whereas even today, I mean, both Gaya and other centers of Buddhist pilgrimage, they are worldwide centers. People come here, they want to come here, but we have not yet done much to make this happen. So I think this is one area, apart from the COVID and economic recovery that was mentioned by Ambassador Vishnu Prakash and Professor Swaran Singh. I think this is an extremely important thing. But it is also important from a larger perspective. And the larger perspective is that of the new world order that is beginning to shape up. Today we have a world order which was led by the Western crafted by the Western countries, based on certain principles. But now I think we must bring culture, we must bring health, we must bring cyber, we must bring many other elements which impact all of us very deeply into this conversation about the new world order. So I'm glad that Vice President is today bringing to the table what India can bring to SCO during the Indian chairmanship.
Right. That's very well put forth in terms of the civilizational issues, and of course, like what the cultural moorings of this of SCO could be. Well, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, now let me, as we're talking about what the Vice President addressed here was primarily focusing on what India's contribution lies in the post-COVID world order. Now, looking ahead, and especially he emphasized on the health initiatives, the economic recovery. Now, where do you see India in the post-COVID order, especially in terms of the health infrastructure, considering that we are among the countries who are in race for manufacturing vaccine?
Well, India is clearly at the forefront, and there is absolutely no doubt about that. India is being recognized as the world's pharmacy, and not pharmacy. India is being able to supply a whole range of vaccines and medications at very competitive prices, maintaining the quality standards. It is no mean achievement. The fact that during in the last few months, despite having had serious issues with the pandemic, India has supplied medicines and other medical provisions to 150 countries. Is something that has to be noted, and has been noted everywhere in the world. Also, Prime Minister has made it clear that the vaccine that India produces is not just for India, but it's for the mankind. And in this present juncture, where I'll not name names, but there are countries which are hoarding medication and vaccine. I know of a couple of countries which have ordered or are planning to have 3 times the number of vaccines as their population. For India to speak vocally about sharing it with everybody is something which is being greatly appreciated. And we have leading candidates of vaccines. Prime Minister himself went yesterday or day yesterday to some leading vaccine production centers. He is leading from the front. So certainly on the health front, this is a very important initiative, which is much appreciated by the world. And certainly India's traditional medication has a lot of there is a lot of global interest in Ayurveda, So that is also something that we are willing and happy to share with the world.
Well, right, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash. Now, let me go on to Dr. Swaraj Singh. Sir, if I quote Vice President here, what he said in the middle of his address, that economic growth and trade can only operate in the environment of peace and security. Peace is the essential prerequisite for progress. How important is the issue of terror in this region, and how SCO can address this issue, and of course, take the bull by horns?
Two things I was saying. One, that terrorism is a global problem, has been well established, and India has played a very significant role in convincing the world that this is a shared problem for everybody.
Right.
Now, when it comes to this region, Eurasian region where Shanghai Cooperation Organization is located, some of the countries have been particularly connected with this issue of terrorism. And therefore, I think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization addressing the subject becomes particularly significant. And that is why in 2004, Shanghai Cooperation Organization had actually set up something called counter-terrorism structures, regional anti-terrorism structures, which is called RATS. And over years, this has made an enormous contribution. And if figures that I have up to 2017, the RATS, which is regional anti-terrorism structures, had deported around 500 terrorists from one country to the other. And also, as they claim themselves, have really revealed and neutralized about 600 terrorist threats. So there is a track record. And building further on the track record, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, led by the big three, India, China, Russia, have also had series of military exercises, in which case anti-terrorist exercises have often been one of the major significant focus. So Shanghai Cooperation Organization has enormous experience, established institutions, but also a region which faces that threat all the time. And therefore, I think the point to be raised that development, and where Vice President did mention how India is a demographically such a young society, 29 years of average age, as he mentioned, which shows enormous potential. And if that potential has to be achieved, then peace must be established. And the fundamental threat to peace is terrorism in the region. You will remember that in September only, India's National Security Advisor had walked out of a meeting of Shanghai Cooperation Organization because a neighboring country's representative had put up a map. And therefore, these kind of nuanced way of undermining building of consensus remains a challenge. And therefore, India has to take a lead, just as India has taken a lead over the years, not just at United Nations in building global consensus in addressing issue of terrorism, but also in all regional organizations, including Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, as I said, is the largest regional organization, which India will now be chairing for the coming year. So other than dealing with the immediate challenge of pandemic, this perennial ongoing issue of terrorism will fundamentally remain a second most important issue in the coming year, as you will see multiple meetings and sort of mechanisms being built over a period of time. And Shanghai Cooperation Organization will perhaps strengthen its so far built structures and agreements that they have had on the issue.
Right. That's very well put, Dr. Swaraj Singh, and especially the instance where one member nation, neighboring country had taken up the issue. Had displayed a map over there. Let me read that in conjunction to what the Vice President said, that it's rather unfortunate that certain attempts have been made to deliberately bring bilateral issues into SCO and blatantly violate the well-established principles and norms. Well, Mr. Arvind Gupta, let me ask you here. So does these tactics by certain countries, and we know which countries here, so you think that this is also a challenge for the intra-dynamics of the SCO grouping, sir?
Yes, I think is a risk. And as we have seen in the past, Pakistan in one of the meetings did show those maps and did vitiate the atmosphere. And today, the mention of cross-border terrorism, etc., I do not know how it will be read in Pakistan. And you also mentioned peace and security.
Yes,
Now, of
yes,
course,
that's a
it's a
prerequisite.
very
Yes.
a kind of benign. It's a kind of a benign phase. But if you look at the context, today peace is disturbed because of the India-China tensions. Peace is disturbed because there is a problem between India and Pakistan. So SCO would have to tread very carefully if because such issues can come up. There is no guarantee that Pakistan at some point of time would not raise these issues. Then how will the SCO handle it? Last time, Russia, showed some deft diplomacy and they were able to somehow manage to douse it. But these problems can certainly come up.
Well, right. Now, before we close, let me come to Ambassador Vishnu Prakash here. So, the Vice President also emphasized on the economic initiatives of India, of the country, like especially the special group on the startups and innovation. We know that how important or stress that has been laid by the government on the startups, on the economic recovery, and of course, India's commitment towards cooperation within the SCO. Now, how that will take to new heights as more and more countries, do you see them playing a proactive and positive or constructive role in the organization? Sir.
Yes. Today's world is the world of innovation. And countries' growth, countries' development depends on how innovative you are.
Right.
And fortunately, in the innovation index, India is doing very well. And we have our strengths for a variety of reasons. One is our youthful population, young population, our educated population. As the Vice President said, we have today 1 billion mobile phones in the country, and that is only indicative of how the digital world has seamlessly meshed with our way of life. So that is another strength. And that is why we are now the third country in the world to have the largest number of unicorns. So given the strength, given the emphasis on digitization of India, innovation is the buzzword. And innovation is something that needs a mindset, needs an ecosystem.
Right.
We have managed to create that ecosystem. We still need to go a long way. But today we are in a position to share our experiences with other countries. And every country, by the way, there are very few countries which are willing to do that. Innovation is something that countries try to hide because it is commercially very valuable. So in that kind of a milieu of suspicion, to be able to open up that sacred space, so to say, to other countries, and particularly I think we are addressing it to the Central Asian nations, is something that will be very well received. Now, having said that, I must also mention that there is a bit of a concern that we need to address and we cannot gloss over. When we are taking the initiative on innovation or startups, that we cannot only address it to certain countries and not address it to make it available to all the countries. Now, here is a situation when there is a country with which we have serious difficulties. There are, in fact, two countries, but our northern neighbor, China, is a country with which we are decoupling. We are, for what they have done against vis-a-vis India, the way they have violated the sanctity of the LSE, we have made it very clear that it cannot be business as usual. So,
that's true.
The only thing that I wonder is that how are we going to harmonize the two aspects? On the one hand, offer this platform of innovation, and secondly, we are distancing ourselves or decoupling with China. How can we keep them away? But overall, the approach is right, because one of the key thrusts for us is to engage with the Central